Walk through the grand halls of the Biltmore Estate today, and you will hear a story of beauty and genius. Tour guides talk about 250 rooms, priceless art, carved stone, and a dream brought to life by George Washington Vanderbilt II. They describe the estate as America's largest private home, a symbol of vision and wealth during the Gilded Age. Visitors look up at the 70-foot ceiling in the banquet hall, admire the massive library, and walk through carefully restored gardens. Everything feels grand, almost magical. It feels like a fairy tale built from limestone and steel. But behind this beauty is another story, one that is quieter, more complicated, and sometimes uncomfortable. Because Biltmore was not only built with money and imagination, it was built with risk, sacrifice, displacement, and human struggle. To understand that hidden cost, we must begin before Biltmore even existed, with a tragedy that deeply affected the Vanderbilt family, and shaped the way George Vanderbilt would build his mountain mansion. On August 25, 1892, in Newport, Rhode Island, a fire broke out in the mansion of George's older brother, Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The house was a massive wooden structure, filled with expensive art, furniture, and decorations collected from Europe. It stood as a symbol of the Vanderbilt fortune, which was one of the largest in America at the time. Electricity had only recently been introduced into homes, and early electrical systems were often dangerous. That night, sometime around 3 a.m, flames began spreading through the lower floors of the mansion. By the time servants noticed the smoke, it was already too late. Fire moved quickly through the wooden beams and walls. The family escaped into the night, wearing only their nightclothes. But not everyone survived. 3 servants, Mary Murphy, Catherine Connolly, and Thomas Lynch, died in that fire. They were Irish immigrants working far from home, earning a living in the service of one of America's wealthiest families. They slept in the servants' quarters, which were built more simply than the grand family rooms. When the fire spread, those areas burned fast. The Vanderbilt fortune could not protect them. No amount of money could reverse what had happened. The fire shocked society, but it also revealed something important. Gilded Age mansions were often built for beauty, not safety. Wood construction, gas lamps, fireplaces in almost every room, and early electrical systems created constant risk. Wealthy families wanted larger and more impressive homes each year, but safety standards had not caught up with ambition. The tragedy in Newport changed the way the Vanderbilts thought about building. When Cornelius rebuilt his mansion, known as the Breakers, he made sure it was fireproof, using stone and steel instead of wood. But the lesson did not only stay with him. George Vanderbilt was deeply affected by what he saw. Watching a grand mansion turn into flames showed him that wealth did not mean invincibility. It showed him that beauty without safety could end in disaster. So when he continued planning his dream home in North Carolina, he made one decision very clear. His house would be fireproof. This decision shaped Biltmore from the ground up. Unlike many large homes of that time, Biltmore was built with a steel frame. Steel was expensive and more difficult to work with, but it provided strength and protection. The exterior walls were made from Indiana limestone, carefully cut and transported long distances. Inside, advanced sprinkler systems were installed. Multiple exits were designed into the layout. The house had modern plumbing, electric lighting powered by its own generator, and heating systems that were considered cutting-edge for the 1890s. George wanted medieval beauty inspired by French châteaux, but he also wanted modern safety. The result was a mansion that looked old-world, but functioned with new technology. Visitors today see the romance of European design, but underneath that design is a structure built out of fear and memory. The memory of fire, the memory of loss. Yet even as George tried to build something safer, the cost of creating Biltmore was already growing in other ways. The land he chose in the mountains of North Carolina seemed empty to him at first glance. The hills stretched wide and green. Forests covered the slopes. Rivers flowed quietly through valleys. To George, it looked like untouched wilderness, waiting for transformation. But it was not empty. More than 1,000 people lived on that land. Many were small farmers struggling to survive after the Civil War. Some were formerly enslaved families who had built modest homes and small communities. Others were white families whose ancestors had farmed those hills for generations. They were not wealthy. Their land had been overused and damaged by years of logging and poor farming practices. But it was home. George Vanderbilt began purchasing land piece by piece, eventually buying around 125,000 acres. By the standards of the time, he paid fair prices. He did not force people out with violence. But when a wealthy man buys nearly everything around you, choice becomes limited. Roads that once connected neighbors now crossed private property. Water sources fell within estate boundaries. Slowly, families sold their land and moved away. Some relocated nearby. Others left the region completely. Small churches closed. Schools shut down. Family cemeteries were left behind in the forests. George believed he was improving damaged land, and in some ways he was right. He hired forestry experts like Gifford Pinchot to restore the soil and replant trees. Over time, parts of the estate would become protected forest land, including what later became Pisgah National Forest. The environment recovered. The forests returned. But the communities that once lived there did not. This is the hidden beginning of Biltmore's story. A mansion built to prevent tragedy was rising on land that had quietly changed hands. A fire in Newport had inspired stronger construction. But strength in stone did not erase the human cost of transformation. When Biltmore opened in 1895, it stood as a symbol of wealth, innovation, and artistic vision. It also stood on land that had once been home to thousands of lives now scattered elsewhere. None of this makes George Vanderbilt a villain in simple terms. He followed the laws of his time. He paid what was considered fair. But history is rarely simple. Progress for one group can mean loss for another. The forests grew taller. The mansion stood stronger. And the fairy tale began to take shape. But beneath that story of beauty and safety was a deeper truth. Every grand dream leaves footprints behind it. By the time construction began on the Biltmore Estate in 1889, the land had already changed forever. Forests were being cleared in new ways. Rail lines were extended into areas that had once been quiet farmland. And hundreds of workers began arriving from different parts of America and Europe. The dream of George Washington Vanderbilt II was no longer an idea on paper. It was becoming stone, steel, and dust. But turning that dream into reality required something more powerful than vision. It required labor, it required strength, and it required men willing to take dangerous risks every single day. At the peak of construction, more than 1,000 workers were on site. Some were local men who had once lived on the land that was now part of the estate. Others came from nearby towns like Asheville. Skilled craftsmen arrived from Italy, France, England, and other parts of Europe. They were stone cutters, wood carvers, metal workers, plaster artists, and engineers. Many of them had never seen a project this large before. Biltmore was not just another mansion. It was the largest private home ever built in America. And it was being built in a remote mountain area where modern construction tools were limited. The house was designed by the famous architect Richard Morris Hunt, who had also worked on grand homes in Newport. Hunt understood how difficult this project would be. Every block of limestone had to be cut in Indiana, numbered carefully, and shipped by rail to North Carolina. From there, it was moved to the building site using wagons and temporary tracks. Each stone weighed hundreds of pounds. Workers lifted them using ropes, pulleys, and simple machines. There were no modern cranes. There were no hard hats. There were no safety harnesses. If a rope snapped or a worker slipped from scaffolding, there was nothing to stop the fall. Working conditions were harsh. Days often lasted 12 hours. Summers in North Carolina were hot and humid. Winters were cold, especially high in the mountains. Workers dug foundations by hand using shovels and pickaxes. When they hit solid rock, they used dynamite. Explosions sometimes went wrong. Cave-ins happened. Injuries were common. Records from that time are incomplete, so no one knows the exact number of workers who died during construction. But historians believe that on a project of this size, several fatalities were likely. Some men may have fallen from high scaffolding. Others may have been crushed by heavy materials or suffered deadly infections from untreated wounds. In the 1890s, even a broken leg could become fatal if infection set in. George Vanderbilt was not known as a cruel employer. In fact, by the standards of the Gilded Age, he treated workers better than many wealthy men did. He built a small hospital on the estate to treat injured workers. Doctors and nurses were available to provide care. He also created housing for many laborers in what became known as Brick Village, a small community near the estate. These brick homes were simple, but stronger and cleaner than many rural houses at the time. Workers were paid steady wages, but better treatment did not eliminate danger. Even with medical care nearby, construction remained risky. The Italian stonemasons faced some of the most dangerous jobs. They stood high above the ground, carving detailed designs into limestone. The banquet hall ceiling, which rises 70 feet above the floor, required careful placement of heavy materials. One mistake could mean death. The steel frame that made the house fireproof also created new risks. Massive beams had to be lifted and secured precisely. Electricity, which was still new technology, powered parts of the project. Electrical shocks were possible. Steam-powered machines had few safety guards. In many ways, the construction of Biltmore was a balance between advanced technology and old-fashioned risk. Yet despite the danger, the mansion slowly took shape. The exterior walls rose tall against the mountain sky. Windows were installed. Towers and chimneys reached upward. Inside, rooms were filled with carved wood panels, marble fireplaces, painted ceilings, and elaborate staircases. Each detail required careful craftsmanship. Some artisans left small marks hidden in corners, quiet signatures that remain today. Visitors walking through the house may admire the beauty without realizing how many hands shaped each stone and board. After 6 years of construction, Biltmore was finally ready. Christmas Eve, 1895, was chosen as the grand opening. George invited family and close friends to celebrate the completion of his dream home. Everything had to be perfect. The heating system, powered by massive boilers, was designed to keep all rooms warm. The plumbing system provided hot and cold running water to dozens of bathrooms. Electric lights illuminated hallways and grand spaces. Elevators moved guests between floors. The kitchen staff prepared elegant meals in newly built kitchens. On paper, it was a masterpiece of modern living. But reality is rarely perfect on the first day. That first Christmas at Biltmore did not go smoothly. Soon after guests arrived, problems began appearing one after another. The heating system developed leaks. Some rooms were too hot, while others were freezing cold. Pipes struggled under full pressure. In certain bathrooms, water would not flow properly. In others, water overflowed and caused minor flooding. Electric lights flickered or failed in parts of the house. One elevator reportedly became stuck between floors and had to be manually adjusted. Servants rushed through corridors, trying to fix problems while maintaining calm appearances. In the kitchens, confusion added to the chaos. Many staff members were newly hired and had never worked together before. Preparing a multi-course Christmas dinner for important guests in a brand-new kitchen proved challenging. Some dishes arrived late. Others were not cooked exactly as planned. It was not a complete disaster, but it was far from perfect. George Vanderbilt, who had spent years planning every detail, felt embarrassed. He had imagined flawless elegance. Instead, he faced the reality that even the grandest mansion could not control every problem. Over the next few months, engineers repaired the heating system, plumbers corrected pipe issues, electricians adjusted wiring, staff members became more experienced. By the spring of 1896, Biltmore functioned much more smoothly. The system stabilized. Guests enjoyed comfortable visits. The estate began to develop its reputation as a place of beauty and innovation. But that first imperfect Christmas remained a reminder that even unlimited wealth could not guarantee instant perfection. Construction had tested the physical strength of workers. The opening night tested George's patience and pride. Yet deeper challenges were still ahead. Behind the polished doors and marble floors, the daily operation of Biltmore required a large group of servants. Nearly 80 full-time staff members worked to keep the house running. They cleaned rooms, prepared meals, polished silver, washed linens, tended fires, and served guests. Without them, the mansion would have been nothing more than an empty building. And in 1898, just 3 years after opening, tension among those servants nearly created another crisis, one that threatened to shut down the smooth image of Vanderbilt perfection. By 1898, the Biltmore Estate looked complete from the outside. The heating system worked properly. The electric lights no longer flickered. The plumbing was stable. Guests arrived and left impressed by the beauty of the home built by George Washington Vanderbilt II. On the surface, the grand experiment in the North Carolina mountains had succeeded. But inside the servants' corridors and workrooms, a different story was developing. Running Biltmore required nearly 80 full-time servants. That number could increase when large gatherings were held. These workers woke up before sunrise and often worked until late at night. They cleaned fireplaces, carried coal, washed dishes, polished silver, changed bedding, prepared meals, and stood silently during long dinners. Their work was constant and physically demanding. Many of them lived on the estate in servants' quarters, small rooms that were simple and far less comfortable than the guest bedrooms upstairs. George Vanderbilt paid wages that were considered fair for the time. Servants received room and board along with monthly pay. Compared to some other wealthy households of the Gilded Age, Biltmore offered stable employment. But fare by the standards of the 1890s did not mean easy or comfortable. 12-hour days were common. Days off were limited. Servants were usually promised a few hours free on Sunday afternoons, but when guests were visiting or events were scheduled, those breaks often disappeared. Over time, frustration began to grow. The lower-ranking servants did the most difficult physical work and had the least freedom. They watched head servants such as the butler or housekeeper enjoy better rooms and slightly higher pay. Small complaints slowly turned into larger conversations. A few servants began discussing the possibility of demanding changes together instead of suffering in silence. In 1898, tension reached a breaking point. A group of servants approached management with complaints. They wanted their promised time off to be respected. They asked for better heating in some of the servants' rooms. They requested that small accidents, like broken dishes, no longer result in wage deductions. These requests were not extreme. They were basic demands for fairness and dignity. The idea of servants organizing together was unusual for that time, especially in a wealthy household. In many estates across America and Europe, workers who complained were simply dismissed and replaced. There were always others willing to take their place. But replacing dozens of trained servants at once would have created chaos at Biltmore. The house was too large and too complex to operate without experienced staff. When George learned about the unrest, he was surprised. He believed he had treated his employees reasonably well. He had invested in housing and medical care. Yet he also understood that losing a large group of staff at once would damage the estate's reputation and daily operation. Instead of firing the leaders of the movement, George chose to listen. Meetings were held. Some of the demands were accepted. Efforts were made to improve heating in servant areas. The policy of automatically deducting wages for broken items was reconsidered. Time-off rules were clarified. Not every request was granted, but enough changes were made to calm the situation. The threatened mass resignation never fully happened. Most servants remained at their posts. Life at Biltmore continued. But something important had changed. The workers had learned that even in the house of a Vanderbilt, their voices could matter if they stood together. And George had learned that maintaining a grand estate required more than beautiful architecture. It required understanding the people who made daily life possible. For several more years, Biltmore operated as George had imagined, a private retreat for family and invited guests. He married Edith Dresser in 1898, and together they began raising their daughter Cornelia within the walls of the estate. George focused on his collections of books and art. He continued supporting forestry work that would later influence American conservation efforts. The estate appeared stable and prosperous. Then, in 1914, tragedy struck again. George Vanderbilt died suddenly at the age of 51 after complications from an appendectomy. His death shocked family and friends. He had spent much of his adult life building and shaping Biltmore. Now the estate faced an uncertain future. The timing was especially difficult. World War I was beginning in Europe. Economic conditions were unstable. Maintaining a property as large as Biltmore required enormous yearly expenses. Taxes on large estates were increasing. Staff salaries, repairs, heating and landscaping all demanded constant funding. Without George's direct management and fortune, Edith Vanderbilt faced difficult decisions. Edith proved to be practical and determined. She reduced expenses where possible. Some land was sold. In 1917, she sold approximately 86,000 acres of forest land to the federal government. That land later became part of Pisgah National Forest. The sale helped protect the forest permanently, and also provided financial stability for the family. But even with these adjustments, the cost of maintaining Biltmore remained high. The era of massive private estates was slowly ending across America. Many wealthy families were forced to abandon or demolish their mansions due to rising costs and new taxes. Biltmore faced the same risk. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, financial pressure increased again. Tourism began growing in the region as Americans started traveling by automobile. In 1930, Cornelia Vanderbilt opened Biltmore House to the public for tours. This decision marked a major turning point. The private family home became a public attraction. Opening the house to visitors was not simply about sharing beauty, it was about survival. Ticket sales provided steady income to support maintenance and employees. Over time, restaurants, shops, and a winery were added to the estate. The property slowly transformed from a private residence into a carefully managed business operation. Today, Biltmore is still owned by descendants of the Vanderbilt family. It employs thousands of people and welcomes millions of visitors each year. Weddings are held in its gardens. Wine is produced on the grounds. Seasonal festivals attract tourists from around the world. The estate generates millions of dollars annually to cover operating costs, restoration projects, and staff salaries. From the outside, it may appear as a preserved symbol of the Gilded Age, but inside, it functions as a modern enterprise. The fairy tale mansion must earn its keep, and that is perhaps the final hidden cost of building Biltmore. What began as one man's private dream required the displacement of communities, the labor of thousands, and the risk taken by workers whose names are largely forgotten. It demanded constant adaptation after George's death. It required opening the doors of a once private palace to the public. The beauty remains, the architecture still inspires awe, but the meaning of the house has changed over time. Biltmore is no longer simply a home. It is a business built on history. It stands as both a masterpiece of design and a reminder of how wealth shapes landscapes and lives. Its walls carry stories of ambition, tragedy, conflict, survival, and reinvention. When visitors walk through its halls today, they see chandeliers and carved stone. They admire art and antiques. They imagine a glamorous past. Few think about the farmers who once lived on the land, the workers who lifted heavy stones, the servants who demanded fair treatment, or the widow who fought to keep everything from collapsing. Yet all of them are part of the story. The hidden cost of building Biltmore was not just measured in dollars. It was measured in effort, sacrifice, change, and endurance. And that cost continues even now as the estate balances preservation with profit, history with tourism, memory with marketing. Biltmore survives because it adapted. It survives because it became something different from what George first imagined. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Even the grandest dream must change if it is to endure. When people walk through the doors of the Biltmore Estate, they see beauty. They see massive fireplaces, long marble hallways, carved wood ceilings, and views of the Blue Ridge Mountains that look like something from a dream. It feels peaceful, grand, almost magical. But before the chandeliers were lit and the gardens were planted, the land told a very different story. Long before tourists arrived, small farming families lived in those hills. They worked the soil, they raised animals, they built simple homes with their own hands. When George Washington Vanderbilt II began buying land in the 1880s, many families sold their property. Some were happy to sell, others had little choice. Wealth moves differently than ordinary life. When a man with millions decides to build a dream, resistance becomes difficult. Entire communities slowly disappeared from the mountains. Their names are rarely mentioned in tours today, but their absence made Biltmore possible. Construction began in 1889. What George wanted was not just a house. He wanted a castle inspired by French châteaux. He hired architect Richard Morris Hunt and landscape designer Frederick Law Olmsted. Together, they planned something America had never seen before. The house would have 250 rooms. It would take years to complete. And to build it, thousands of workers were needed. The work was hard and dangerous. This was the late 19th century. There were no modern safety laws, no worker protections. Men worked with heavy stone, iron beams, and early construction tools. Some fell. Some were crushed. Records from that time are incomplete, but historians believe workers died during construction. Those deaths were not unusual for that era. Large projects often came with human cost. But it reminds us of something important. Beauty is often built on sacrifice. When Biltmore opened on Christmas Eve in 1895, it was celebrated as a masterpiece. Newspapers called it America's greatest home. Guests were amazed. But inside the estate, a quiet tension was already growing. Running a house this large required a small army of servants. At its peak, around 80 servants worked inside the home. They cooked, cleaned, polished silver, tended fires, washed clothes, and served guests. Life below stairs was very different from life above. Servants worked long hours. Heating in their quarters was limited. Time off was rare. Upper servants like the butler and housekeeper had spent years climbing the social ladder inside service. They accepted harsh conditions because that was the system. But younger servants began to question that system. Why accept poor treatment just because it had always been that way? Why should comfort only belong to those upstairs? Tension grew quietly. Complaints were made. A threat of mass resignation hung in the air. George Vanderbilt faced something he did not expect: resistance inside his own palace. He was progressive in some ways. He supported forestry conservation. He believed in scientific farming, but he also believed in hierarchy. He believed some people were meant to lead and others to serve. Eventually, small changes were made. Better heating, more regular time off, fewer charges for broken items. By today's standards, these improvements seem basic. But in 1898, they were meaningful. It showed that even inside a grand estate, power could be challenged. Biltmore stood as a symbol of American wealth, but from the beginning, it also reflected the inequalities of its time. Land was cleared, communities moved, workers risked their lives, servants pushed back. The fairy tale was already more complicated than it appeared. In the early 1900s, Biltmore was not just a house, it was a social stage. Wealthy guests came for hunting trips, dinners, and long weekends in the mountains. But one hunting trip changed everything. In 1902, during a hunt on the estate, a guest was accidentally shot. The details were kept quiet. Hunting accidents were not rare at the time, but this one ended in tragedy. The injured man later died from infection, which was common before antibiotics. His family filed a lawsuit. They argued that safety precautions were not strong enough. The lawsuit dragged on for months. For George Vanderbilt, it was devastating. A guest had died on his land. Beyond the personal grief, there were legal risks. If he was found responsible, it could change how wealthy estate owners across America hosted events. The case eventually settled. No admission of guilt was made, but something had changed. Biltmore could no longer operate like a European aristocratic estate. America was different. In America, wealth did not mean legal immunity. A private paradise still existed under public law. Then came an even greater shock. On March 6, 1914, George Vanderbilt died during surgery in Washington, D.C. He was only 51 years old. The official cause was complications from an appendectomy. Surgery in 1914 was risky, anesthesia was primitive, infection was common. Most historians believe his death was simply tragic and unfortunate. But his death had enormous consequences. George left behind his wife Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt and their young daughter Cornelia. He also left behind an estate that was incredibly expensive to operate. Biltmore cost hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to maintain. Staff salaries, farming operations, upkeep of the house, the expenses never stopped. Then World War I changed the country. To fund the war, the U.S. government raised estate taxes dramatically. When the Internal Revenue Service reassessed George's estate, they valued it at around $15 million. The tax bill demanded was over $3 million, an enormous amount. Edith did not have that much cash. Most of the wealth was tied up in land, art, and the house itself. Selling Biltmore would destroy her husband's dream, so she fought back. For 5 years, she battled the government in court. Her lawyers argued that Biltmore was difficult to sell. Who would buy a 250-room mansion in rural North Carolina? The government argued it was priceless. Legal fees drained money. Edith sold tens of thousands of acres of land. Staff numbers were reduced. Parts of the house were closed to save on heating. Finally, in 1923, a settlement was reached. The final tax bill was reduced, but the damage was done. Biltmore survived, but smaller, weaker, changed. George had built a self-sufficient dream. Edith turned it into a fight for survival. Today, Biltmore is still owned by Vanderbilt descendants, but it is no longer simply a private home. It is a large business operation. Over 1 million people visit each year. Ticket prices range from around $75 to $95. There are restaurants, hotels, shops, and even a winery on the estate. Maintaining the property costs tens of millions of dollars annually. Hundreds of employees work there. Climate control systems protect artwork. Preservation teams repair stone, wood, and fabric constantly. The house survives because it earns money. It is no longer just a symbol of personal wealth. It is an economic machine designed to preserve history. Compared to other Gilded Age mansions like the Breakers, which became museums run by preservation societies, Biltmore remains in family hands. But ownership today is complicated. The family must carefully manage taxes, maintenance, and succession planning to avoid losing the estate. In many ways, Biltmore owns them as much as they own it. Visitors see elegance and beauty. They walk through rooms filled with priceless art. They admire the architecture. But behind the scenes is constant work, constant cost, and constant responsibility. The hidden cost of building Biltmore was not just money. It was displaced communities. It was dangerous labor. It was legal battles. It was financial pressure. It was transformation. George Vanderbilt wanted to build something that would last forever. He succeeded, but not in the way he imagined. His private retreat became a public attraction. His dream became a corporation. His paradise became a responsibility carried by future generations. Biltmore still stands. It is magnificent. It inspires millions. But every stone tells two stories, one of beauty and ambition, and one of sacrifice and survival. That is the hidden cost. As you walk through the halls of the Biltmore Estate today, it is easy to be swept away by its grandeur. The chandeliers sparkle like captured stars. The floors gleam with perfectly polished marble, and the ceilings rise impossibly high, painted and carved in meticulous detail. The gardens outside stretch across acres of carefully planned landscapes, fountains, and terraces, framed by the Blue Ridge Mountains, which seem eternal and serene. Visitors pause at the windows to photograph the views, marvel at the architecture, and imagine the life of George Vanderbilt, the scholarly heir who dreamed of building a palace in the American wilderness. It feels almost magical, almost untouched by the passage of time, almost like a fairy tale frozen in stone. And yet, for all its beauty, for all its perfection on the surface, Biltmore is not merely a home. It is not merely a display of wealth. It is not merely the culmination of one man's vision. To understand Biltmore fully, to truly grasp what it represents, you must look beyond the glittering halls and the carefully curated gardens, beyond the polished tours and the charming anecdotes, into the hidden cost, the human cost, the financial cost, the social cost, and the moral cost that made it all possible and continues to shape its existence to this day. It is a cost that began long before the first stone was laid, when entire families were displaced from the rolling mountains of North Carolina to make way for George's dream, when farmers and small landowners, many of whom had lived on that land for generations, sold or were forced to abandon their homes, leaving behind fields, barns, and memories that could never be replaced. It is the cost of the laborers who built Biltmore, men who worked with primitive tools and under dangerous conditions, moving enormous stones, lifting iron beams, erecting scaffolds that reached dizzying heights without safety nets, without modern protections, without hope that the accident that might claim their life would even be recorded in history. Some of these men died during construction, their names lost to time, their sacrifices unacknowledged. Yet every floor, every wall, every carved detail that now inspires awe carries a story of toil, pain, and human endurance. It is the cost of the servants, hundreds of them, who worked endlessly behind the scenes, cooking, cleaning, polishing silver, maintaining fires, and serving an aristocratic vision that did not yet consider their comfort, their rights, or their humanity. When some of them began to push for better treatment, more time off, better heating, fairer conditions, George Vanderbilt responded only partially, showing pragmatism but never fully rejecting the hierarchical worldview he inherited. This tension inside the house, this quiet struggle between tradition and progress, between obedience and dignity, marked Biltmore not as a simple triumph of design, but as a living, breathing social experiment in labor, hierarchy, and negotiation, the consequences of which would ripple for years. It is the cost of mistakes and tragedies that could not have been anticipated. The hunting accident that took the life of a guest revealed the fragility of even the grandest dreams. In those forests, meant for leisure, recreation, and the ostensible refinement of life, a single misstep, a misfired shot, turned joy into grief, social gatherings into legal nightmares, and a dream into a cautionary tale about the limits of wealth and control. George's wealth, immense though it was, could not shield him from the consequences of human error, nor from the legal realities of a society in which aristocratic privilege held no sway. And it is the cost of George himself, who died at 51 during what should have been routine surgery, a man whose death, though medically understandable, sparked rumors, conspiracy theories, and endless speculation, because the timing of his passing could not have been worse for the survival of his estate. Leaving his wife, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, and their young daughter Cornelia, to face legal, financial, and operational challenges that would demand all of Edith's intelligence, courage, and endurance. Edith's 5-year struggle with the IRS, a battle to preserve the estate from tax seizure, required legal acumen, strategy, sacrifice, and determination. She had to sell land, auction art and furnishings, reduce staff, and close parts of the house, all while raising a young daughter and maintaining enough of Biltmore's operational structure to ensure it could survive into the future. Her victory was partial. Biltmore survived, but it was smaller, diminished, and forever altered from George's original vision. It was a victory that came at the cost of comfort, of resources, of legacy, and perhaps of innocence. A reminder that even the wealthiest and most powerful cannot escape the weight of law, society, and circumstance. And today, in the 21st century, Biltmore exists as a living paradox, a home and a business, a family residence and a tourist destination, a symbol of wealth and refinement, yet also of responsibility and constraint. It costs tens of millions of dollars to maintain annually, employing hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly, in roles ranging from conservation specialists to tour guides, security personnel, groundskeepers, hospitality staff, and administrators. The estate generates revenue from tickets, restaurants, hotels, retail, and a winery. Yet even with this impressive income, it requires constant reinvestment, preservation, and management to survive. Modern visitors see only a fraction of this reality. They marvel at the architecture, they admire the art, they stroll through gardens with cell phones and cameras in hand, capturing the beauty without understanding the ongoing labor, planning, and financial strain that keep the estate functional and intact. They see a fairy tale. History sees complexity, struggle, and sacrifice. The cost of Biltmore is not measured solely in dollars, nor even solely in lives. It is measured in generations of effort, in family obligation, in the tension between beauty and practicality, between inheritance and responsibility, between public enjoyment and private dream. Each room carries stories of ambition and failure, of triumph and human vulnerability, of ideals tested against reality. Each stone, each beam, each meticulously carved detail reflects choices that were impossible to make without consequence. It is measured in the lost land, the displaced families, the unseen deaths, the nearly revolted servants, the tragic accidents, the court battles, the decades of toil by a widow defending a dream she did not create, and the descendants today who inherit both privilege and prison in the form of an estate that cannot be sold, altered dramatically, or abandoned without irreversible loss. The cost is also psychological. To live with Biltmore is to live with responsibility that overshadows personal freedom. To own it is to be tied to history, to manage a legacy that demands constant attention, adaptation, and sacrifice. The descendants who walk its halls do so knowing that every decision about maintenance, taxation, visitation, preservation, staffing, succession carries weight beyond ordinary life. They cannot treat it lightly, and yet, through all of this, Biltmore continues to inspire awe. It is magnificent. It is human. It is flawed and enduring. Its survival is a testament not merely to wealth, but to tenacity, strategy, sacrifice, and the ability of individuals, George, Edith, their descendants, and the countless staff who maintained it, to adapt, to persevere, and to fight for something greater than themselves. And so, the hidden cost of building Biltmore is vast, layered, and enduring. The cost of human lives lost in labor, the cost of displacement, the cost of legal battles, the cost of financial pressure, the cost of decades of management, the cost of adaptation and compromise, the cost of carrying a dream forward when the dream itself is impossibly expensive to maintain. It is the cost of ambition and beauty, intertwined with human fragility and societal limits, a cost paid not by money alone, but by generations of people, choices, struggles, and sacrifices that made a fairy tale in stone possible, yet tethered to reality in ways that George Vanderbilt could never have imagined. And perhaps that is the truest lesson Biltmore offers. Greatness is never free. Every dream has a price, every palace a shadow, and every legacy a responsibility that transcends time. Biltmore is magnificent, but its magnificence was earned through struggle, endurance, and the willingness of many to sacrifice for a vision that was never just a house, but a statement of human ambition, aspiration, and perseverance. The beauty remains, but the cost endures. And the story behind every polished floor and soaring ceiling reminds us that history, like Biltmore itself, is magnificent, complicated, costly, and profoundly human.